So this is a bit of a pre-quiz. The question here is which of these trees is native and what would be the ecological benefit of using it? So there are three trees up here. Serviceberry, Amelanchier species. In Alabama, our most common serviceberry is Amelanchier arborea. But the genus as a whole supports 119 caterpillar species in the eastern US. So it's a host plant to over 100 different species of caterpillar that will turn into moss. So it's an ecological driver, in addition to the berries, of course, which many birds like. In the middle is Ginkgo biloba, which is a non-native tree from East Asia. It's a good street tree. It's got great fall color. It provides normal beneficial tree functions like cooling the ground around it, but it is not a host plant to anything in Alabama. So it doesn't have that same sort of ecological benefit of actually supporting the production of insects and their reproduction. And then finally, there's Callery pear. The most common cultivar name for Pyrus caleriana is Bradford. Many people know that one. That tree is not only non-native, but it's invasive, so it spreads in the landscape to the extent that it replaces native plants and it drives down biodiversity overall. So now that we have a taste for some of the ornamentals on offer that are native to Alabama and can work in the home landscape, let's move on to the why. One reason is simply regional character. As I mentioned, when you see oakleaf hydrangea, there's a good chance you're in Alabama. You know you're in the center of the South. We also have some of the highest diversity of native helianthus or sunflower species with 22 native species of sunflower. Of course, the challenge there is matching which species can you obtain commercially and what actually matches your landscape goals and characteristics. You may have heard one reason why more and more people are choosing to plant native plants is that they are locally adapted, and that can mean they're lower input. So often in a native plant gardening system, there aren't inputs of fertilizer or chemical sprays. The idea is that you match species that may have thrived there naturally in that soil type without the addition of a lot of human generated inputs, and you're choosing species that work well ornamentally, that match with that landscape, and it's a low input system. The issue is, of course, many of our landscape sites are no longer native soil with highly developed soil microbial life and soil structure. So in highly disturbed and compacted areas, which often occurs during the construction process, that dramatically alters the habitat that you're putting native plants in. So there can be some remediation required there. And of course, there's a lot of knowledge and research that has to go into successfully matching native plants with desirable ornamental characteristics to the specific site at hand in terms of soil pH, sun and shade, moisture preference. Not every native plant works in every situation, but if you can do a good job matching the natives to your specific site, they will be low input. The biggest reason in my mind to plant native plants in landscape setting is for habitat connectivity and ecosystem services. So we talked a little bit about caterpillar host plants with the serviceberry, and again what that means is that some plants have specific associations with insects such as caterpillars, which turn into moths or butterflies, where that caterpillar eats the leaves of a plant or may be able to eat leaves of multiple different plants, and that is the food source it needs to turn into the adult stage and continue its life cycle. So pictured there is a Gulf fritillary butterfly. On the top, you've got the caterpillar, which is eating the foliage of the native Passiflora incarnata. On the bottom, it's shown on a flower. But here, that is a one-to-one relationship where the caterpillar of that butterfly species can only eat the leaves of Passiflora incarnata. That's all it's capable. It can only eat Passiflora. In Alabama, that's either Passiflora incarnata or Passiflora lutea. Once it's adult, it can get pollen and nectar from many different species of flower, regardless of their geographical origin. But if it's in a landscape with all non-native flowers, or native plants that are not Passiflora incarnata, it's not going to be able to continue its reproductive cycle. Of course, we also have pollen specialists that we mentioned with the butterfly milkweed, where certain native bees, mostly solitary bees, have specific relationships with native flowers, where they really rely on the specific species to survive and reproduce. Here's another example of a host plant. So pictured here is common pawpaw, Asimina triloba. It is a host plant to the zebra swallowtail butterfly, meaning pawpaw has evolved chemicals called Ananaesis acetogenins, which it evolved to deter insects eating it. But this particular species of butterfly, the zebra swallowtail, has been able to overcome that and actually ingest those chemical compounds. So that's led to a one-to-one relationship where in order to see a zebra swallowtail butterfly, there has to be a pawpaw, an Asimina genus species available in the landscape. That can be the common pawpaw, which is shown here, which is a fairly attractive small tree that also works well in partial shade, or it could be small flower pawpaw, Asimina parviflora. I should, of course, mention ecology is complex. It's definitely not always a one-to-one relationship. So in the picture there, you see several other swallowtail caterpillars. Pipevine swallowtail will feed on the native pipevine. Spicebush swallowtail feeds on our native spicebush, which is a nice forest shrub. It can also eat a few other native plants. In the case of golden alexander, which is a native spring blooming carrot family plant, that is a host plant to the black swallowtail butterfly, along with rattlesnake master, which is another nice native flower. But the black swallowtail can consume anything in the carrot family, such as European derived plants like carrots, dill, fennel. So those are also host plants to a black swallowtail butterfly, even though they're non-native. But to choose a good ornamental native, you could go with golden alexander or rattlesnake master. So again, some people like to see butterflies in the landscape, but why else should we care about producing caterpillars in our landscapes that will turn into moths and butterflies? A big reason is that almost all birds rear, at least in part, their young baby birds on insects, particularly caterpillars. Caterpillars are essentially little protein packs, and birds need to feed their babies in the nest many caterpillars to be able to successfully reproduce. And most caterpillars eat either a specific plant or a specific genus of plants. And the most reliable way to produce caterpillars is to plant or maintain the native plants on which they've evolved these ecological relationships where they feed on them. And there is concerning news about populations of birds in the U.S. over the past 70 or so years. We've seen declines in the number of birds of almost every type, the exception being wetland birds, but other birds, especially grassland birds, but also forest generalist birds, have really declined in population due to a number of factors, but one of the biggest is certainly habitat loss. So when we plant native plants in our residential habitats, especially if most people in the neighborhood do it, that can be part of replenishing the habitat and making sure our bird populations can recover. So we've talked about the concept of host plants, but it's also important to note that certain plants are keystone plants, meaning large numbers of insects and other organisms rely on them, and certain plants, such as oaks in the eastern U.S., produce a lot more biodiversity than other plants. All natives are important, of course. They all have a role supporting specialists, but these keystone plants are really the ecosystem drivers, producing about 75% of the insect food required by birds. Another reason to plant natives is simply to prevent the possibility of additional invasive plants, which have caused ecological harm here. So unfortunately, around half of all invasive plants were intentionally imported for ornamental use. Again, not all ornamentals are invasive. Not all non-native ornamentals, such as ginkgo, which is certainly not a problem, Others fit that mold as well. But many of our invasive plants were brought over intentionally as ornamental plants, and often it takes them several decades to actually become invasive. So privet, Chinese privet, was here in the 1920s, and it took really until the 1950s or 60s before it took off and was recognized as an issue, as an invasive plant. So there can be a lag there of several decades when a new plant is introduced to the time that it all of a sudden makes this large jump and rapidly becomes an invasive plant. Here are some examples of invasive plants that were intentionally introduced in the horticultural trade. Things like English ivy, Callery pear, the non-native wisterias, and we do have a native one, Japanese honeysuckle, periwinkle, all introduced for ornamental purposes, and they're all invasive now. That was the ecological reasons why native plants are meaningful, and you might choose to use them in the landscape. Now we'll talk a little bit about what are the limitations of native. So one is that we don't have great native lawns in Florida and in southern Alabama. St. Augustine grass is technically a native there. But for most of the eastern U.S., we don't have native lawn grasses, and many of the benefits that we would be seeking from a native planting wouldn't be available in a monoculture of a short lawn grass anyway. But of course, lawn does have a purpose, whether it's simply to provide for foot traffic, athletic fields. There's of course aesthetic and value judgments involved there, and more of a consistent maintenance. There's also advantages of horticultural trade plants. They tend to perform well in a broad range of soils. That's why those species are in the hort trade. They've been bred for large, long-lasting blooms, and they often have compact growth, which many people have found desirable. So they've been bred for ornamental settings, and we've become accustomed to that. Other challenges with native plants is they can be difficult to propagate, so there aren't as many nurseries currently selling them. And then again, the challenges we mentioned in matching natives to your soil type, your sun versus shade, the hydrology. Natives, even though they're native to Alabama as a whole, they will have specific preferences for certain microclimates and soil types, especially when your soil has been altered through construction or compacted by parking on it, or any number of those urban challenges especially. It can become difficult to put native plants into a compacted, essentially early succession habitat when it really would have preferred being in an old growth prairie with a highly developed microorganism communities in the soil. Other limitations of natives are some of them are having problems. Of course, there's always a certain amount of disease present in an ecosystem that might not be desirable for a homeowner to see on the foliage. But now we have a number of non-native fungal diseases and insects, invasive insects, that are causing major problems on some of our native trees. Pictured there is dogwood anthracnose, which is a non-native fungal disease of dogwood. Eastern flowering dogwood has long been an ornamental plant. It's a nice small tree, works well in settings where you want a smaller specimen. A lot of dogwoods are suffering right now from the anthracnose. A lot of them are dropping leaves, and they look bad, and this is a disease they didn't evolve with that's causing serious harm. The extreme example of that was the American chestnut, which is now almost functionally extinct, no longer found as a mature tree in our forest due to an invasive fungal pathogen that came in about 100 years ago. There's an example of a invasive insect causing problem to a native tree, in this case emerald ash borer, causing some real health problems to native ash trees, which were formerly a good choice for a medium to large size landscape tree.